The October sun beat down mercilessly on the vast expanse of Wyoming territory, turning the red rocks into furnaces and the sparse grass into brittle straw. Ethan McGraw sat on his porch, weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, surveyed the 4,000 acres that sprawled before him, land he'd bought with blood, sweat, and more loneliness than any man should carry. At 43, Ethan cut an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet with shoulders broadened by years of breaking horses and wrestling cattle. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who'd survived where others hadn't. His face, tanned and lined by wind and sun, rarely showed emotion. The ranch hands whispered he had a heart of stone, but they didn't know about the nights he sat by the graves behind the hill, talking to shadows that never answered back. The Double M Ranch was his empire, built from nothing after the war took everything. 20 years ago, he'd been a different man, had a wife named Sarah with laughing eyes and a boy who called him Papa. But the Comanche raid of '61 had left him with nothing but ashes and a hole in his chest that no amount of cattle or gold could fill. "Boss!" The voice belonged to Jake Thornton, his foreman, a grizzled veteran who'd ridden with Ethan since the early days. "Rider coming in from town. Looks like that lawyer fellow, Morrison." Ethan stood, joints protesting after sitting too long. He'd been expecting Morrison, though the tightness in his gut suggested he wasn't entirely sure about what he'd set in motion. 3 months ago, in a moment of weakness, or perhaps clarity, he'd answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. "Send him up," Ethan said, his voice rough as sandpaper. Morrison was a small, neat man who looked perpetually uncomfortable outside his Denver office. He dismounted awkwardly, dusting off his black suit with nervous hands. "Mr. McGraw," he said, producing a handkerchief to wipe his brow. "I have news regarding your disarrangement." The word hung in the air like smoke. Arrangement. It sounded cold, businesslike, which, Ethan supposed, it was. He'd paid $500 to a marriage broker back east, a small fortune for most men, but pocket change for him. In return, he'd receive a wife, a mail-order bride, they called it, though Ethan preferred not to dwell on how that sounded. "Well?" Ethan asked, offering no pleasantries. Morrison pulled out a daguerreotype from his leather case. Miss Abigail Collins, 22 years of age, originally from Baltimore. Her father was a dock worker who passed from consumption last winter. She has basic education, can read and write, knows household management. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "She's agreed to the terms and will arrive on Tuesday's stage." Ethan took the photograph with steady hands that belied the sudden racing of his heart. The image showed a young woman with dark hair pulled back severely, but even the formal pose couldn't hide the determined set of her jaw or the intelligence in her eyes. She wasn't beautiful in the classical sense. Her features were too strong for that. But there was something about her expression that spoke of strength. "Tuesday," Ethan repeated. 4 days. "Yes, sir. The agency suggests you might want to prepare. Perhaps clean up the house a bit. Women appreciate such gestures." Ethan's jaw tightened. His house was clean enough. Maria, the Mexican woman who cooked and kept house twice a week, saw to that. But as Morrison rode away, Ethan found himself walking through his home with new eyes. The main house was large, 10 rooms built from timber and stone, but it felt empty. Sarah's rocking chair still sat by the fireplace, covered in dust. His son's carved wooden horse lay on the mantel where he'd placed it 15 years ago. That night, Ethan sat at his massive oak table, eating Maria's beef stew in silence. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He'd built an empire here, 2,000 head of cattle, a dozen horses, enough money in the bank to buy half the territory. But what good was an empire with no one to inherit it? He thought of Tommy, the orphan boy he'd hired last spring to help with chores. 14 years old with sandy hair and a quick smile. The kid reminded him painfully of what he'd lost. Tommy slept in the barn, despite Ethan offering him a room in the house. Trust came hard to boys who'd been kicked too many times. The next morning, Ethan found himself in town, standing awkwardly in Paulson's general store. Mrs. Paulson, a formidable woman who knew everyone's business, raised an eyebrow as he examined bolts of fabric. "Redecorating Mr. McGraw?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "Need new curtains," he said gruffly. Heard there's a stage coming in Tuesday with some interesting cargo." News traveled fast in Cedar Ridge. By now, half the town probably knew about his mail-order bride. He could imagine the whispers. Ethan McGraw, so desperate he had to buy a wife? Rich rancher thinks he can purchase happiness like a prize bull. "Blue," he said suddenly, pointing to a bolt of fabric the color of a clear sky. "I'll take enough for the front windows." Mrs. Paulson's expression softened slightly. Was Sarah's favorite color, wasn't it? Ethan paid without answering and left with his package. On the way back to the ranch, he stopped at the cemetery on the hill. 2 wooden crosses marked the graves, the names barely visible after so many years of weather. He'd offered to buy proper headstones, but somehow that felt too final. "I'm doing something that might be foolish," he told the graves. "Bringing a woman here. She's young, probably full of dreams about the West that'll get crushed quick enough." He pulled a weed from beside Sarah's cross. "But the nights are getting longer, and I'm tired of talking to ghosts." Sunday came with a dust storm that turned the sky yellow and sent tumbleweeds racing across the yard like departed souls. Ethan spent the day preparing, had Maria cook extra food, made sure the guest room he couldn't think of it as their room not yet was aired out. He even had Jake and the boys repair the loose board on the porch. "You fixing to impress someone, boss?" Jake asked with a knowing grin. "Just maintaining the property," Ethan replied, but he caught Jake exchanging looks with the other hands. Monday night, he couldn't sleep. He walked out to the corral where his prize stallion, Midnight, stood watching the stars. The horse nickered softly, and Ethan ran his hand along the animal's neck. "What am I doing?" he asked the horse. "I'm too old, too set in my ways. She's probably expecting some romantic hero from those dime novels, not a broken-down rancher who talks to horses and dead folks." But it was too late for doubts. Come morning, he'd ride to town and meet the stage. Meet Abigail Collins, who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. He wondered what desperation had driven her to answer that advertisement. Poverty, adventure. Or was she running from something, just like he was running from his loneliness? As dawn broke on Tuesday, painting the mountains purple and gold, Ethan dressed in his best clothes. Black pants, white shirt, the leather vest Sarah had made him that he rarely wore. He looked at himself in the mirror, seeing his father's face staring back, weathered, hard, unforgiving. "You bought yourself a bride, you old fool," he told his reflection. "Now you gotta live with it." Tommy appeared as Ethan was saddling Midnight. The boy looked nervous, fidgeting with his worn cap. "Mr. Ethan, is it true what they're saying? You're bringing a woman here?" Ethan paused, seeing the fear in the boy's eyes. Fear of change, of losing the only stable home he'd known. "Yeah, it's true." "She gonna make me leave?" The question hit Ethan like a physical blow. He turned to face Tommy fully. "No one's making you leave, boy. This is your home as long as you want it." Tommy nodded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. Ethan understood. They'd both built walls around their hearts, and now a stranger was about to walk through their carefully ordered world. As Ethan rode toward town, the morning sun warming his back, he thought about the words he'd written to the marriage broker. Seeking a strong woman not afraid of hard work or isolation. Must be willing to help run a household and adapt to ranch life. Pretty words and false promises not required. Just honesty and commitment. He'd been drunk when he wrote it, sitting alone on Christmas Eve with only a bottle for company. But drunk or not, He'd meant every word. He didn't need love. Had that once and lost it. He just needed someone to share the burden of living, someone to make the empty house feel less like a tomb. The town came into view, and Ethan could see a crowd gathering near the stage depot. His arrival caused a stir, conversations stopping mid-sentence as he tied Midnight to the hitching post. He ignored the stares and whispers, focusing on the cloud of dust approaching from the east. The stage was coming. In minutes, his life would change irrevocably. He'd paid for a bride, but as the wheels rumbled closer, Ethan McGraw wondered if he'd bargained for more than he could handle. The morning sun caught the dust, turning it to gold, and somewhere in that golden cloud was Abigail Collins, carrying her own hopes and fears across the wild frontier to meet a stranger who would become her husband. The die was cast. All that remained was to see how it would fall. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in a cloud of dust and creaking leather. Ethan stood rigid as a fence post, watching the driver climb down and begin unloading luggage. The door swung open, and an elderly woman emerged, followed by a traveling salesman. Then, nothing. For a moment, Ethan wondered if she'd changed her mind, if he'd been made a fool of in front of the whole town. Then a gloved hand appeared on the doorframe, followed by a modest brown traveling dress. Abigail Collins stepped down from the coach with careful precision, one hand holding her bonnet against the Wyoming wind. She was smaller than the photograph suggested, barely reaching his shoulder, but she stood straight despite the obvious exhaustion in her movements. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and time seemed to pause. Her eyes were green, he noticed, like sage after rain. They held uncertainty but no fear, taking his measure just as he was taking hers. Her face was pale from the journey, framed by dark hair that had escaped her severe bun in wisps. There was a smudge of dust on her cheek that somehow made her more real than any portrait could. Ethan forced his feet to move, crossing the space between them with measured steps. Up close, he could see the determined set of her jaw that the photograph had captured, but also the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched a worn carpet bag. "Miss Collins," his voice came out rougher than intended. "Mr. McGraw." It wasn't a question. Her voice was steady, with a slight Eastern accent that sounded foreign in this rough town. "I apologize for my appearance. The journey was more arduous than anticipated." "No need for apologies." He reached for her bags, noting how few there were. 2 carpet bags and a small trunk, her whole life condensed into what she could carry. "You must be tired." "Yes." Simple, honest, no flowery words or false bravado. The crowd watched with undisguised interest. Ethan saw Mrs. Henderson whisper something to Mrs. Vale, their faces pinched with disapproval. He felt Abigail stiffen beside him, her chin lifting slightly. "My wagon's over here," he said, louder than necessary. "Let them gossip. They'd paid good money for the right to make their own choices." As he loaded her belongings, she stood quietly, observing the town with those keen green eyes. Cedar Ridge wasn't much, one main street with a general store, saloon, church, and various businesses. Compared to Baltimore, it must have seemed like the edge of the world. "It's not Baltimore," he said, immediately regretting stating the obvious. "No," she agreed, a slight smile touching her lips. "But I didn't come here for Baltimore." He helped her into the wagon, noting how she accepted his hand without hesitation but released it the moment she was seated. Proper, but not prudish. As they drove through town, he was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the faint scent of lavender soap cutting through the dust and leather. "The ranch is about 5 miles out," he said, feeling the need to fill the silence. 4,000 acres. Run about 2,000 head of cattle, some horses." "That's substantial." She gripped the seat as they hit a rut. "You built it yourself." "Started with nothing after the war." He didn't elaborate. No need to burden her with old ghosts on her first day. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the creak of wheels and the distant cry of a hawk. Ethan stole glances at her, noting how she took in the landscape without complaint, even as the sun beat down mercilessly. "It's beautiful," she said suddenly, gazing at the red rocks and endless sky. "Severe, but beautiful. Most find it harsh. Most haven't lived through a Baltimore winter with no coal." The words slipped out, and he saw her stiffen, as if she'd revealed too much. "Ranch house has plenty of firewood," he said carefully. "You'll not go cold." She nodded, fingers smoothing her skirt. "Mr. McGraw, I believe we should discuss expectations." The agency was vague about certain matters. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. Here it was, the business transaction laid bare. "I need someone to help run the household. Maria comes twice a week for heavy cleaning and cooking, but daily matters need tending. I'm not—" He paused, searching for words. "I'm not expecting anything you're not willing to give. You'll have your own room unless you decide otherwise." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "That's considerate, and my duties. Keep house, help with meals. Maybe tend the kitchen garden if you're inclined." He hesitated. "There's a boy, Tommy, orphan. He helps with chores, sleeps in the barn. He could use some civilizing influence." "I see." She was quiet for a moment. "And what of companionship conversation, or do you prefer silence?" The question surprised him. "I'm not much for talk, but not opposed to it." "No." "Good. I find excessive silence oppressive." She turned to face him fully. "I should tell you, Mr. McGraw, I'm not meek. The advertisement said you wanted someone strong. I am. I've had to be. If you were hoping for someone who'd simply smile and obey, you've made a poor bargain." Despite himself, Ethan felt his lips twitch. "Noted." The ranch came into view as they crested a hill, and he heard her sharp intake of breath. The house sat like a fortress against the landscape, solid and imposing. The outbuildings spread in organized clusters: barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, various sheds. It was an empire built from sweat and determination. "It's larger than I expected," she said. "Too large for one person," he admitted, then wished he hadn't. Tommy appeared as they pulled up, hanging back near the barn, but clearly curious. His eyes widened as he took in Abigail, and Ethan saw her notice the boy's worn clothes and wary posture. "Tommy," Ethan called, "come meet Miss Collins." The boy approached slowly, cap in hand. "Ma'am." "Hello, Tommy." Her smile was warm, but not condescending. "Mr. McGraw tells me you're quite helpful around here." "Yes, ma'am. I try to be." "Would you help with my bags? I'd be grateful." Tommy practically beamed, rushing to grab the carpet bags. As they entered the house, Ethan watched Abigail take in her new home, the heavy furniture, the stone fireplace, the layer of dust on surfaces Maria hadn't reached. "Your room," he said, leading her down the hall. It was the best guest room, with a window overlooking the mountains and a quilt his mother had made. "Take your time settling in. Supper's at 6. She stood in the doorway, looking small and a bit lost. "Mr. McGraw." "Thank you for the separate room, for being honest about things." He nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "I'll leave you to it." That evening, supper was an awkward affair. Maria had left a pot of stew, and Abigail insisted on serving, moving around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. They ate in near silence, the clink of spoons against bowls loud in the quiet. "The stew is good," she said finally. "Maria's a fine cook. I can cook. My mother taught me before she died." "How old were you?" 12. She met his eyes. "Old enough to remember, young enough to adapt." After supper, She rose to clear the dishes. "I'll wash up." Tommy, usually. "I need to learn where things are." It wasn't a request. He watched her work, noting the careful way she handled the dishes, the methodical approach to an unfamiliar kitchen. When she finished, she turned to find him still observing her. "Was there something else?" "We should discuss the marriage." The words felt like stones in his mouth. "Judge Patterson can perform the ceremony Thursday, if that suits." "Thursday?" She dried her hands slowly. "Yes, I suppose we shouldn't delay. The town is already talking." "Let them talk." "Easy for you to say. You're established here. I'm the stranger who sold herself for security." The bitterness in her voice was sharp but brief. "I apologize. It's been a long journey." "No apology needed. It's not an easy situation for either of us." She studied him for a long moment. "Why did you do it? A man like you could have his pick of local women." Ethan looked away. "Local women want things I can't give." "Such as?" "Romance. Pretty words. A heart that isn't buried on the hill." The silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't come here for romance, Mr. McGraw. I came for honesty and a chance at a life that's mine to build. Perhaps we can offer each other that much." "Perhaps we can." Later, alone on the porch with his coffee and cigarette, Ethan replayed the day. She was nothing like Sarah. Where Sarah had been soft and laughing, Abigail was sharp and serious. Where Sarah had needed protecting, Abigail seemed to have armor already in place. Maybe that was what he needed. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something entirely different. Someone who understood that life was hard and didn't expect him to pretend otherwise. Through the window, he could see a lamplight in her room. Was she unpacking her few belongings, writing letters to friends back east, or was she sitting on the bed, wondering what desperation had driven her to travel 2,000 miles to marry a stranger? "A rancher bought a bride," he said to the darkness, tasting the truth of it. "But I reckon I might have found more than that." Only time would tell if he was right. The night wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain. Change was in the air, whether he was ready or not. Inside, a woman he'd paid for but didn't own was preparing for sleep in a strange bed, in a strange land, tied to a stranger by necessity and hope. Thursday they'd be married. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, curiosity about tomorrow. It wasn't much. But for a man who'd been living in the past for 15 years, it was a start. As he headed inside, he noticed the kitchen was cleaner than it had been in months. Dishes stacked neatly, surfaces wiped down. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. Perhaps that's how it would be. Small alterations that added up to a new life. He paused at her door, seeing the light still on underneath. For a moment, he considered knocking, offering some word of comfort or welcome. But what would he say instead? He continued to his own room, to his own cold bed, knowing that in 2 days, everything would be different. For better or worse, Abigail Collins was here. The bargain was struck. Now they had to live with it. The rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn darkness, but Abigail was already awake. Her first morning at the Double M Ranch had been restless, filled with unfamiliar sounds, wind rattling windows, cattle lowing in the distance, the house settling with creaks and groans. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days, and made her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, Ethan was already there, coffee brewing on the stove. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "You're up early," he said. "Baltimore habits. Father left for the docks at 4:30. She moved to the stove, checking the coffee. "May I?" He nodded, watching as she efficiently set about making breakfast. "You don't have to. I need to earn my keep, Mr. McGraw. Thursday's ceremony doesn't change that I came here for a purpose." She found eggs in the cooling box, bacon in the smokehouse lean-to just outside the kitchen door. Within minutes, the smell of cooking filled the room. Tommy appeared like a ghost, drawn by the aroma. "Morning, ma'am," he said shyly. "Good morning, Tommy. Hungry?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then wash up and set the table. 3 places." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The boy usually eats at this table. I hope." Her tone was mild but firm. "Unless you object." For a moment, tension crackled between them. Then Ethan shrugged. "Your kitchen, your rules." It was a small victory, but Abigail felt it keenly. Tommy's face lit up as he scrambled to wash his hands and set out plates with careful precision. When they sat down to eat, the boy wolfed down his food like he was afraid it might disappear. "Slowly," Abigail said gently. "It's not going anywhere." After breakfast, Ethan headed out with his men, leaving Abigail to explore her new domain. The house was well built but neglected in small ways. Curtains sun-faded and dusty. Floors that hadn't seen a proper scrubbing in months. Windows clouded with grime. "Can I help?" Tommy hovered in the doorway, clearly torn between his usual chores and curiosity about this new presence. "Yes," she handed him a bucket. "We'll start with the windows. Can you show me where the well is?" They worked through the morning, Tommy chattering about the ranch, the horses, the time he'd seen a mountain lion on the ridge. Abigail listened, occasionally asking questions, learning the rhythms of this place through a boy's eyes. "Mister, Ethan saved me," Tommy said suddenly, pausing in his window washing. "Found me trying to steal eggs from the henhouse last spring. Could have shot me or called the sheriff. Instead, he gave me work and a place to sleep." "He seems a fair man," Abigail said carefully. "He's sad, though, never says so, but I can tell. He goes up to the cemetery on the hill sometimes, just sits there." Abigail filed this information away, adding another piece to the puzzle of Ethan McGraw. By noon, the main room windows sparkled, and she discovered treasures beneath the dust. A beautiful oak sideboard, a rocking chair that needed only oiling to stop its squeak. She was heating leftover stew for lunch when hoofbeats announced visitors. 3 women rode up to the house, their faces set in expressions of determined charity. Abigail recognized the type church ladies come to inspect the new arrival. She smoothed her apron and stepped onto the porch. "Ladies," she greeted them, neither warm nor cold. The lead woman, tall and angular with steel-gray hair, dismounted with practiced ease. "I'm Martha Henderson. This is Mrs. Vale and Mrs. Cooper. We're from the Cedar Ridge Methodist Church." "Abigail Collins, please, come in." They swept into her clean parlor, sharp eyes taking in every detail. Abigail served coffee with steady hands, using the good china she'd found in the sideboard. "So," Martha Henderson began without preamble, "you're the mail-order bride?" "I am. No point in dancing around it. It's quite scandalous. You know, advertising oneself like cattle at auction." Abigail's spine stiffened. "I find it no more scandalous than gossiping about neighbors over coffee." "Mrs. Vale gasped. "Mrs." Cooper hid a smile behind her cup. Martha's eyes narrowed. "You're very direct." Mr. McGraw advertised for a strong woman. I assume he didn't mean strong in body alone." "And what of your background, your family?" "Dead." Abigail met her gaze steadily. "Consumption took my parents. Poverty took everything else. I could have stayed in Baltimore, worked in a factory until the machines took my fingers or my lungs. Instead, I chose this. I'm not ashamed of survival. Mrs. Henderson." "The church. I'll attend when I can. Though I wonder if your Christian charity extends to all of God's children, or only those who meet your approval." The silence stretched taut. Finally, Martha Henderson rose. "Well, I suppose we'll see what sort of woman you truly are." After they left, Abigail found her hands shaking. She'd made an enemy, possibly several, but she'd learned long ago that showing weakness to such women was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. That afternoon brought a different challenge. While exploring the barn, she found one of the milk cows in distress, her calf stuck in a difficult birth position. The ranch hands were all out on the range with Ethan. Only Tommy remained, and he looked terrified. "Get rope and water," Abigail ordered, rolling up her sleeves. "And clean rags if you can find them." "But ma'am, shouldn't we wait?" "This calf won't wait." She'd helped with births in Baltimore when neighbors couldn't afford a doctor. Cattle weren't so different. Working by feel and instinct, she managed to turn the calf, her dress soaked with sweat and worse. Tommy held the lantern, eyes wide. "Now," she said, "when I say pull, you help me, gentle but steady." Together they worked, and finally, with a wet slither, the calf emerged. It lay still for a heart-stopping moment before shaking its head and bleeding. The cow turned, lowing softly, and began cleaning her baby. "You did it," Tommy exclaimed. "You saved them both." Abigail leaned against the stall, exhausted and filthy but triumphant. "We did it." That's how Ethan found them an hour later. Abigail sitting in the straw, her good dress ruined, watching the calf take its first wobbling steps while Tommy recounted the adventure with animated gestures. She just reached right in. Ethan wasn't scared at all. Ethan's expression was unreadable as he took in the scene. "You all right?" "Fine, though I'll need a new dress for Thursday." "Jake," he called to his foreman, "get Mrs. Paulson to open the store. Tell her Miss Collins needs a dress and whatever else. Put it on my account." "That's not necessary." "You saved a valuable calf and its mother. It's necessary." He paused. "Thank you." That evening, as she soaked in the copper tub Tommy had filled for her, Abigail reflected on her first full day. She'd made enemies and allies, saved lives, and ruined her second-best dress. Not what she'd expected, but then nothing about this place was... A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Yes." "Got packages from town." Ethan's voice came through the wood. "I'll leave them outside." When she emerged, wrapped in her thin robe, she found not one but 3 packages. Inside were 2 practical day dresses, a nightgown, undergarments, and, surprising her, a dress suitable for church or special occasions in deep green wool. There was a note in Ethan's blocky handwriting. "For Thursday, green suits you." She pressed the note to her chest, feeling something shift inside her. It wasn't romance. She'd been truthful about not seeking that, but it was consideration, perhaps even kindness. The next morning brought a dust storm. Fierce wind driving sand against the windows she'd just cleaned. Abigail battened down what she could, then found herself trapped inside with Tommy, who was coughing from the dust. "Come here," she said, wetting a cloth. "Hold this over your nose and mouth." She made him tea with honey she'd found in the pantry, and they sat at the kitchen table while the storm raged outside. To distract him, she asked about his lessons. "Don't have any," he admitted. "Can't read much." "Would you like to learn?" His eyes widened. "You'd teach me? If Mr. McGraw doesn't object." When Ethan and the men finally returned, covered in dust and exhausted from fighting to keep the cattle from scattering, they found Abigail and Tommy bent over a slate, practicing letters. "The boy has chores," Ethan said, but without real heat. "Which he completed before the storm hit?" Abigail replied, "An educated hand is more valuable than an ignorant one. Wouldn't you agree?" Ethan watched Tommy carefully forming an A on the slate. Something in his expression softened. 1 hour a day, after chores. Tommy's grin could have lit the whole territory. That night, as they ate supper beef and potatoes Abigail had managed despite the storm, conversation came easier. Ethan told them about finding a creek that might run year-round, crucial for the dry season. Tommy recited the alphabet. Abigail shared a story about Baltimore storms that made even Ethan crack a smile. "Tomorrow we go to town," Ethan reminded her as she cleared the dishes. "For the ceremony." "I haven't forgotten." Having second thoughts, she turned to face him fully. "Are you?" "No." The word was firm. "You've proven yourself already. The calf, the boy, standing up to Martha Henderson. Heard about that from Mrs. Cooper's husband." "I hope I didn't cause you trouble. I've got no use for hypocrites, in church or out." He stood, suddenly seeming to fill the room. "Abigail, may I call you that?" "Yes." "I want to be clear. This marriage, it's legal and binding. But I meant what I said about your room. About expectations. You've got a home here as long as you want it, on whatever terms suit you. And if those terms change," he met her eyes steadily, "then they change, but not without your say-so." After he left, Abigail stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the table. In 2 days, she'd milked cows, delivered a calf, made an enemy, taught a boy his letters, and somehow started feeling like this strange, harsh place might become home. She thought about writing to her friend Margaret back in Baltimore, but couldn't find the words. How did you explain that you'd traveled across the country to marry a stranger and found not romance, but something that might be better? Respect, purpose, and the possibility of building something real. Through the window, she could see Ethan on the porch, his nightly ritual with coffee and solitude. Tomorrow they'd stand before a judge and make this arrangement legal. But tonight, in this kitchen that was beginning to feel like hers, with a boy learning his letters and a man learning to share his space, it already felt like the beginning of something. Not a fairy tale, but perhaps a true story, one written in dust and sweat and small kindnesses, in saved calves and clean windows and a green dress chosen with care. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight, for the first time in years, Abigail Collins felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Abigail stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting the green wool dress for the 3rd time. Her hands were steady, but her stomach churned with nerves. Through the window, she could see Ethan loading supplies into the wagon, his movements careful and deliberate. Tommy knocked softly. "Ma'am, mister, Ethan says we're ready when you are." She emerged to find both men dressed in their best, Ethan in a black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, Tommy in clean pants and a shirt that looked new. The boy's hair was slicked down with water, though a rebellious cowlick still stood at attention. "You look real pretty, Miss Abby," Tommy said, then blushed furiously. "Thank you. Tommy, you look quite handsome yourself." Ethan helped her into the wagon without comment, but she caught him looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching. The ride to town passed in tense silence, broken only by Tommy's occasional observations about hawks or interesting rocks. Judge Patterson's office was above the Land Records building, a narrow room that smelled of tobacco and old paper. The judge himself was a round man with kind eyes who seemed unsurprised by the arrangement. "Need witnesses," he said, shuffling papers. "Tommy's too young." "I'll fetch Jake and Murphy," Ethan said, but the door opened before he could leave. Mrs. Cooper entered, followed by her husband. "Heard you might need witnesses," she said, ignoring Martha Henderson's disapproval from across the street. "Happy to help." The ceremony was brief, functional. Abigail repeated the words. "Signed where directed." Felt Ethan slip a simple gold band onto her finger. When Judge Patterson said Ethan could kiss his bride, he merely touched his lips to her forehead, a gesture more protective than passionate. "Congratulations, Mrs. McGraw," the judge said, and Abigail realized with a start that she had a new name. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Some faces were curious, others hostile. Martha Henderson stood with her coterie, lips pursed in disapproval. But Mrs. Cooper squeezed Abigail's hand, and several of the ranch hands tipped their hats. Mrs. McGraw, Jake said with a grin, "Boss, we pitched in for a wedding gift." He handed Ethan a wrapped package. "For the missus." Inside was a leather-bound journal and a good pen. "For keeping household accounts," Murphy explained. "Or whatever women folk write about." "Thank you," Abigail said, genuinely touched. "All of you." The ride home felt different. She was no longer Abigail Collins, Baltimore orphan. She was Mrs. Ethan McGraw, rancher's wife, with all the weight that carried. Tommy chattered excitedly about the ceremony, the town, the way Martha Henderson's face had looked like she'd bit into a sour apple. Back at the ranch, Maria had left a special meal, roasted beef, fresh bread, even a cake. They ate quietly, the significance of the day settling around them like dust. After supper, Abigail began clearing dishes out of habit. "Leave them," Ethan said. "It's your wedding day. And tomorrow's tomorrow." They sat on the porch as evening fell, Tommy between them like a small, energetic chaperone. The boy finally dozed off, head against Abigail's shoulder. She felt Ethan watching them in the gathering darkness. "You're good with him," he said. "He's easy to be good to." She stroked Tommy's hair gently. "He reminds me of my brother Daniel, same age when the fever took him." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." She looked at Ethan's profile in the dim light. "Tell me about them. Your family?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then Sarah laughed at everything, even my poor jokes. She made this place feel alive. "And William, Billy, we called him. He was horse crazy from the time he could walk. Would have been 19 now." "How did it happen?" "Comanche raid. I was in town getting supplies. Came back to smoke and ashes." His voice was flat, controlled. "Found them by the creek. They'd tried to run." Abigail reached across Tommy's sleeping form and touched Ethan's hand. He didn't pull away. "I'm not her," she said quietly. "I can't be her." "I know. Don't expect you to be." They carried Tommy to his room, a proper room in the house now, not the barn. As they tucked him in, Abigail felt a strange domesticity in the moment, like playing at being parents. In the hallway, they paused awkwardly. Her door was one way, his the other. "Good night, Abigail," he said formally. "Good night, Ethan." But neither moved. The house creaked around them, settling into night. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Would you... That is, it's cold tonight. My room has the better fireplace." She understood what he was offering and what he wasn't. "For warmth." She agreed. His room was larger, dominated by a massive bed that could have slept 4. He built up the fire while she stood uncertainly by the door. When he turned, his expression was carefully neutral. "I'll take the chair," he said. "That's ridiculous. The bed's big enough for a regiment." She moved to one side, still fully dressed. "We're married now. We can share a bed without other things." He sat on the opposite edge, pulling off his boots. "You're a practical woman." "I've had to be." They lay in the darkness, careful not to touch, the space between them feeling like a chasm. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls. "Ethan, thank you for the dress, for being honest about things, for giving me a chance here. You earned it, that calf, the way you handled Martha. How you are with Tommy, you're already more than I bargained for." She smiled in the darkness. "Is that good or bad?" "Good. Definitely good." They fell asleep like that, on opposite sides of the vast bed, married but still strangers. During the night, the temperature dropped further, and unconsciously they moved closer, seeking warmth. Abigail woke once to find Ethan's arm draped over her waist, heavy and protective. She didn't move away. Morning brought new challenges. Word of the marriage had spread, and neighbors arrived throughout the day, some with wedding gifts, others with thinly veiled curiosity. Abigail played hostess, serving coffee and cake, deflecting intrusive questions with growing skill. "So quick," Mrs. Vale murmured. "One wonders." "One should wonder about their own affairs." Abigail replied sweetly. "More cake." Ethan escaped to tend the cattle, leaving her to manage the social battlefield. By afternoon, she was exhausted, but victorious. Even Martha Henderson had been forced to admire the spotless house and perfectly served refreshments. As the last visitor left, Abigail collapsed in the rocking chair. Tommy brought her coffee without being asked, and she ruffled his hair gratefully. "You did good, Ma," he said, then froze. "I mean, Mrs. McGraw, I didn't mean—" "Ma is fine," she said gently, "if you want." His face lit up like Christmas morning. Ethan returned at sunset, dusty and tired. He found them in the kitchen, Abigail teaching Tommy to peel potatoes while a stew bubbled on the stove. The domestic scene stopped him in his tracks. "Wash up," Abigail said without looking up. "Supper's almost ready." He obeyed, bemused by the easy command in her voice. When he returned, the table was set. Tommy chattering about the visitors, the gifts, how Ma had put Mrs. Henderson in her place. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "He asked, I agreed." She met his gaze challengingly. "Unless you object." "No objection." After supper, they established what would become their routine, Tommy to his studies, Abigail mending by the fire, Ethan working on ranch accounts. The silence was comfortable now, broken by the scratch of Tommy's slate and the pop of burning wood. "Storm coming," Ethan said, glancing at the window. "Feel it in my bones." "Your bones are older than mine," Abigail teased, surprising them both. Though mine are telling the same story. "How old are you, anyway, 22? 24. The agency thought 22 sounded better." She kept her eyes on her sewing. "And you?" 43, old enough to be your father, near enough." "My father was 50 when he died. You're nothing like him." She set down her mending. "Ethan, I need to know something. This marriage, is it just for convenience, for propriety, or do you hope for—" "More." He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. When I sent for a wife, I thought I just needed help with the house. Someone to leave the ranch to, but now—" He gestured helplessly at the domestic scene around them. "You've been here a week, and already it feels different. Better. I don't know what that means." "It means we're building something," she said softly. "Day by day. Isn't that enough for now?" "More than enough." The storm hit that night with vengeance, lightning splitting the sky, thunder shaking the house. Abigail woke to find their bedroom door creaking open. "Tommy," she called softly. The boy appeared, trying to look brave but clearly frightened. "Sorry, the thunder." "Come here," she said, making room between her and Ethan. The boy scrambled in gratefully. "Storm can't hurt you in here." Ethan mumbled, still half asleep. "We've got you." They lay together, the three of them, as the storm raged outside. Tommy fell asleep feeling safe. Abigail dozed with unexpected contentment, and Ethan stayed awake, marveling at how natural this felt, this ready-made family that had somehow formed from loss and loneliness and mail-order promises. When morning came, bringing clean air and puddles reflecting sky, they found the barn had lost some shingles and a fence was down, but as they worked together to repair the damage, Ethan directing, Abigail organizing, Tommy fetching and carrying, it felt like they were building something stronger than fences. We make a good team, Ethan said as they surveyed their work. We do, Abigail agreed, and her smile was warmer than the morning sun. That night, she moved her belongings to his room without discussion. Not for romance, not yet, but for the comfort of shared space, shared warmth, shared purpose. As they settled on their respective sides of the bed, the distance between them had shrunk from a chasm to merely a bridge waiting to be crossed. Ethan. Yes. I'm glad I came here. Glad I answered that advertisement. His hand found hers in the darkness, a brief squeeze before letting go. So am I. Abby, so am I. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the vast Wyoming night. But inside the solid ranch house, a family was taking shape, unconventional, uncertain, but undeniably real. The marriage that had begun as a transaction was becoming something else, something neither of them had dared hope for when they'd struck their bargain. Trust, Abigail thought as she drifted toward sleep. They were building trust, one shared meal, one stormy night, one held hand at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that was the foundation for something that could last. Spring in Wyoming was a liar's promise. Warm sun one day, killing frost the next. Abigail had been at the Double M for 3 months now, long enough to learn its rhythms and recognize trouble when it rode up to the fence line. This particular trouble came in the form of Jeb Dawson and 4 of his men, their horses raising dust clouds visible from the kitchen window. "Ethan," she called, her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. "Company." He emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but held casual-like. Tommy appeared from the chicken coop, eggs forgotten, his young face tight with worry. They all knew Dawson by reputation, a man who got what he wanted, one way or another. "McGraw," Dawson said, not bothering to dismount. He was a big man, soft in the middle but hard in the eyes, wearing prosperity like a weapon. "Heard you got yourself hitched." "I did." Ethan's voice carried no welcome. Dawson's gaze slid to Abigail on the porch. "Mail order bride. Wasn't it like buying cattle through a catalog?" His men snickered. "State your business, Dawson." "Always direct, aren't you?" Dawson leaned forward in his saddle. "I'll be direct too. This drought's getting worse. Your water rights to Miller's Creek would serve better purpose feeding my larger herds. I'm prepared to make a generous offer for your land. Not selling. Now, don't be hasty. Things happen to stubborn men out here. Accidents, fires." His eyes moved to Abigail again, then to Tommy. "Shame when innocent folks get caught up in a man's pride." Abigail stepped forward before Ethan could respond. "Mr. Dawson, would you and your men care for some water? You must be parched, making threats in this heat." The unexpected courtesy threw him off balance. What?" "Water," she repeated, smiling sweetly. "Though I suppose men who threaten women and children might choke on simple hospitality." Dawson's face darkened. "You've got a mouth on you, woman." "Yes, and a witness's memory too. 5 men making threats against a lawful ranch. The marshal in Cheyenne would find that very interesting. Don't you think?" "You threatening me?" "Offering water," she said mildly. "You're the one talking about accidents and fires. I'm just a woman with a good memory and friends who write for the territorial newspaper." That was a lie. She knew no journalists. But Dawson didn't know that. He yanked his horse's head around. "This isn't over, McGraw. That creek water's wasted on a small operation. One way or another, I'll have it." After they rode off, Ethan turned to stare at Abigail. "Friends at the newspaper. Writers need to be creative." She was trembling now that the danger had passed. "But we need to be ready. He meant those threats." "I know." Ethan's hand found her shoulder, warm and steadying. "You did good, Abby, real good." Over the following weeks, signs of Dawson's harassment appeared like a creeping disease. Cut fence lines, spooked cattle, a water hole fouled with dead animals. Each incident was small, deniable, but the message was clear: sell or suffer. Ethan hired 2 more hands, men good with guns as well as cattle. Abigail learned to shoot, spending hours with Tommy in the far pasture, firing at bottles and cans until her aim was true. The boy proved a natural, his young eyes sharp and hands steady. "Never thought I'd be teaching my wife and son to fight," Ethan said one evening, watching them clean their weapons at the kitchen table. "We're not fighting," Abigail corrected. "We're defending what's ours." The distinction mattered. She'd left Baltimore to build something, not tear it down. But if Dawson wanted a war, he'd find the McGraw family ready. The crisis deepened with the drought. By May, the smaller creeks had dried to trickles. Miller's Creek, fed by mountain springs, still ran clear, but lower than anyone could remember. Ethan spent long days moving cattle to water, coming home exhausted and grim. One scorching afternoon, Abigail found him at Sarah and Billy's graves, hat in hand. She approached quietly, grass crunching under her feet. "I'm failing them," he said without turning. "Promised I'd keep this place going, build something lasting. Now I might lose it all." "You're not alone anymore," she reminded him. "We're in this together." He turned then, and she saw something raw in his eyes. "Why, you could leave. Take Tommy. Go somewhere safe. You didn't sign up for this kind of trouble." "I signed up for you. For better or worse. Remember," she touched his face, feeling the stubble and sun-weathered skin. "Besides, you think I'd give Martha Henderson the satisfaction of seeing me run?" That startled a laugh from him. "You really hate that woman." "I really hate bullies. Dawson, Martha, anyone who thinks they can dictate how others should live." She stepped closer. "We'll find a way through this. Ethan, we have to." He pulled her against him then. The first real embrace since their wedding. She felt the strength in his arms, the steady beat of his heart, and something inside her that had been carefully guarded began to crack open. "I don't deserve you," he murmured into her hair. "Probably not," she agreed, making him chuckle. "But you're stuck with me now." That night, a rider came with news. 3 of Dawson's men had been seen near the eastern boundary, where the ranch's main water pipeline ran. Ethan grabbed his rifle, calling for Jake in the hands. "I'm coming," Abigail said, already reaching for her own weapon. "No, you stay with Tommy. Tommy can shoot better than half your men. We're coming." They argued briefly, fiercely, before Ethan gave in. Minutes later, a small war party rode out. Ethan, Abigail, Jake, Murphy, and 2 new hands, with Tommy riding double behind Jake despite Ethan's protests. They found Dawson's men at the pipeline, tools in hand, clearly planning sabotage. The confrontation was brief but tense. Guns drawn but not fired. Threats exchanged like currency. "You're trespassing," Ethan said coldly. "Prove it," one of Dawson's men sneered. "Just out for an evening ride." With wire cutters and a shovel, Abigail urged her horse forward. "Get off our land, now!" Something in her voice, maybe the absolute certainty that she would shoot if pushed, made them back down. They rode off with muttered curses and promises of retribution. "This is escalating," Jake said quietly. "Dawson won't take being faced down by a woman well." "Then Dawson needs to learn some new lessons," Abigail replied. But inside she knew Jake was right. They'd won a skirmish, not the war. Back at the ranch, adrenaline gave way to exhaustion. Tommy fell asleep at the table, head pillowed on his arms. Ethan carried him to bed while Abigail secured the house, checking windows and doors with new paranoia. In their bedroom, the weight of the day settled over them. Abigail sat brushing her hair, hands shaking slightly. Ethan watched from the bed, his expression unreadable. "You were magnificent today," he said finally, "like some avenging angel with a rifle." "I was terrified." She set down the brush. "But they threatened our home, our family." Our family. He repeated the words like he was tasting them. Is that what we are? She turned to face him. Aren't we you, me, Tommy, this ranch? We're building something together. If that's not family, I don't know what is. He stood, crossing to her in 2 strides. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing her cheekbones. Abby? Yes? I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hung between them, unexpected and perfect. She reached up, covering his hands with hers. Think, she whispered. Only think. No, he corrected, and kissed her. It was nothing like the perfunctory kiss at their wedding. This was heat and promise. 3 months of growing trust and affection finally acknowledged. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. I love you too, she said. Heaven help me, I do. They came together again, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful distance in the big bed. For the first time since their wedding, they truly became husband and wife, finding in each other's arms a sanctuary from the troubles waiting outside. Later, wrapped in darkness and each other, they made plans, legal strategies to document Dawson's harassment, letters to territorial authorities, ways to strengthen their water rights claim. It wasn't romantic pillow talk, but it was partnership, and somehow that felt even more intimate. Whatever happens, Ethan said, his voice drowsy with contentment. I'm glad you're here. Glad you answered that advertisement, even if it costs you the ranch. The ranch is just land and cattle. You and Tommy, that's what matters now. She pressed closer, feeling the truth of it. Somewhere between that first awkward meeting at the stage depot and this moment, they'd built something worth fighting for. Not just a marriage of convenience, but a real partnership, a true family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Dawson wouldn't give up easily, and the drought showed no signs of breaking. But tonight, in this bed, in this house on the vast Wyoming plain, Abigail McGraw felt like the richest woman in the territory. We'll win, she said into the darkness. Whatever it takes, we'll protect what's ours. Ethan's arms tightened around her. With you beside me, I believe it. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising either salvation or more trouble. But inside, a mail-order bride and a lonely rancher had found something neither had dared hope for: love forged in adversity, strong as Wyoming granite and twice as enduring. The real fight was still to come, but for the first time since Jeb Dawson had started his campaign of intimidation, Ethan McGraw wasn't facing it alone. He had a wife who could shoot straight and talk sharper, a boy who was becoming a son, and a love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning. It was, he thought as sleep claimed him, more than any man had a right to expect from a $500 investment and a newspaper advertisement. It was, quite simply, everything. The fire started just after midnight, orange tongues licking at the eastern barn where they stored winter hay. Abigail woke to the acrid smell of smoke and Tommy's frantic shouting from the yard. Fire, mister! Ethan, fire! They tumbled from bed, Ethan pulling on boots and pants in one motion while Abigail grabbed her wrapper. Through the window, the barn glowed like a demon's eye against the black sky. Get every hand up! Ethan shouted to Jake, who was already running from the bunkhouse. Form a bucket line from the well! Abigail didn't wait for orders. She ran to the kitchen, filling every pot and bucket she could find. Tommy appeared at her side, face smudged with soot, but determined. The horses, he gasped. Still 3 in the barn. Go, she said. I'll bring water. The scene outside was chaos orchestrated into purpose. Men formed human chains, passing buckets hand over hand. Ethan and Murphy had wet blankets wrapped around themselves, plunging into the smoke to save what they could. The horses came out wild-eyed and screaming, Tommy somehow managing to lead them to safety despite their panic. Abigail worked the pump until her arms burned, filling bucket after bucket. The heat was incredible, turning the night into false day. Sparks flew like deadly fireflies, threatening the other building. "The house!" Jake yelled. "Wind's shifting!" Sure enough, burning debris was landing on the main house's roof. Abigail grabbed Tommy. "Get on the roof with wet blankets. Smother anything that catches." "What about you?" "I'll keep the water coming. Go." For 2 hours they fought. A desperate battle against an enemy that consumed everything it touched. Ethan emerged from the smoke periodically, his face a mask of soot and determination. During one brief moment as he grabbed fresh water, their eyes met. "Dawson," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Prove it later," she replied. "Fight it now." Finally, as dawn broke gray and bitter, the fire began to die. They'd lost the barn and most of the hay, but saved the house and other buildings. Men collapsed where they stood, exhausted and coughing. Abigail moved among them with water and wet cloths, her nightgown ruined beyond repair. "Ma?" Tommy said, appearing at her elbow. His face was streaked with tears cutting through the soot. "Thunder's hurt." The horse, Ethan's second-best mount, had burns along his flank from flying debris. Abigail examined the wounds with gentle hands. "Fetch my medicine box," she told Tommy, "and clean water. He'll be okay, but we need to treat these before infection sets in." As she worked on the horse, she became aware of new hoofbeats. Sheriff Watson from town had arrived, along with several neighbors who'd seen the glow in the sky, and with them, unfortunately, came Jeb Dawson, his face a mask of false concern. "Terrible tragedy," Dawson said loudly. "These old barns, so much dry wood, one spark from a lamp." "No lamps in that barn," Ethan said flatly. "Haven't been since last week." "You suggesting something, McGraw?" Sheriff Watson stepped between them. "Easy now. Let me look around before anyone starts making accusations." Abigail finished with Thunder and joined her husband. She must have looked a sight. Nightgown blackened, hair wild, face streaked with soot and sweat. But when she spoke, her voice carried clear authority. "Sheriff, you might want to check the ground near the southeast corner. That's where the fire started. And I doubt you'll find any lamp fragments there." Watson, a fair man despite the political pressures of his job, nodded and went to investigate. Dawson's smirk faltered slightly. "Careful, Mrs. McGraw," he said quietly when the sheriff was out of earshot. "Accidents can happen to more than barns." "Is that a threat?" "Mr. Dawson." She stepped closer, close enough to smell his cologne over the smoke. "Because I'm getting mighty tired of your implications and midnight visits. You can't prove anything." "Yet," she smiled, cold as Winter Creek water. "But you've made a mistake. You've made this personal." Ethan's hand found her shoulder. Whether in warning or support, she couldn't tell. Around them, their people worked to contain the last of the damage, loyal despite the danger. Even Mrs. Cooper had arrived with her husband, bringing food and bandages. Sheriff Watson returned, holding something in his handkerchief. "Coal oil can," he announced. "Hidden in the brush. Still smells fresh." "Could be anyone's," Dawson said quickly. Too quickly. "Could be. Interesting that you'd know that without looking at it." Watson's eyes were shrewd. "I'll be investigating this proper-like. Nobody leaves the area until I say so." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of questions, statements, and barely contained violence. Several of Ethan's hands had to physically restrain Jake when one of Dawson's men made a crude comment about Abigail's state of undress. Finally, as the sun climbed toward noon, Watson declared he'd seen enough for now. Dawson and his men left under the sheriff's watchful eye, but not before Dawson locked eyes with Ethan one last time. "This isn't over," he mouthed. "No," Ethan said aloud. "It's not." When they were finally alone, or as alone as they could be with half the ranch hands bedded down in the house due to the bunkhouse smoke damage, the full weight of the night crashed down on them. Abigail sank into a kitchen chair. suddenly aware of her blistered hands and aching muscles. "You need to rest," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. His face was haggard, aged 10 years in one night. "We all do." She touched his cheek, leaving a clean streak through the soot. "But first, we need to talk." This was escalation. He's not playing at intimidation anymore. "I know." Tommy appeared in the doorway, swaying on his feet. "I saved the important papers from the office," he said proudly, holding up a lockbox. "The deed and water rights and such." "Good thinking, son." Ethan's use of the word made Tommy straighten despite his exhaustion. "Now go wash up and get some sleep." When they were alone, Abigail leaned into Ethan's shoulder. "We could have died tonight, all of us. But we didn't. He won't stop, you know that." "Then neither will we." He tilted her chin up. "I meant what I said before, about you and Tommy being what matters, but I'll be damned if I let Dawson drive us off our land." "Our land," she repeated. "I like the sound of that. Despite everything, the smoke damage, the exhaustion, the very real danger." He smiled. "Legal-like and everything. What's mine is yours." "Including the troubles, apparently." "Especially those, better or worse. Remember." She kissed him then, tasting smoke and determination. When they broke apart, she stood with renewed energy. "Then we'd better get clever. Dawson has money and men. We need allies and evidence." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time I used my Baltimore street smarts for something besides standing up to church gossips." She moved to the stove, starting coffee with automatic movements. "First, we document everything. Every cut fence, every threat, every incident. Second, we write to the territorial governor. Dawson might own the local law, but he doesn't own Wyoming. Third." She paused, and Ethan saw something in her expression that would have frightened him if it wasn't on his side. "Third," he prompted. "Third, we find out what Dawson doesn't want found. Every man has secrets, especially men who think they're above consequences." Over the next days, as they rebuilt what had been lost, Abigail put her plan into motion. She wrote letters in her careful hand, documenting the harassment with dates and witnesses. She had Mrs. Cooper, whose cousin worked at the land office, quietly researched Dawson's holdings and history. The information that came back was interesting. Dawson's wealth was recent, his land acquisitions suspicious in their timing. 3 ranchers had sold to him in the past 5 years, all after suffering losses to fire or cattle disease. "He's done this before," Abigail told Ethan as they studied the papers by lamplight. Tommy dozed on the sofa, refusing to be sent to bed while important things were discussed. "But no one's challenged him. No one's had us before." She pointed to a name on the list. "This man, Garrett, his wife is Mrs. Cooper's friend. Lives in Cheyenne now. I think I should pay her a visit. Too dangerous." "More dangerous than staying here waiting for the next fire." She covered his hand with hers. "I'm not Sarah. Ethan, I'm not defenseless, and I won't be protected into uselessness." It was an old argument by now, but one that needed saying. He studied her face, thinner now than when she'd arrived, marked by sun and work, but stronger too. "Take Jake with you," he said finally. "And Tommy, boy could use some town polish." She smiled, knowing what the concession cost him. "We'll be careful." The trip to Cheyenne took 2 days. Abigail left Ethan with a kiss and a loaded rifle, trying not to think about what might happen in her absence. But the information she gained from Mrs. Garrett proved worth the risk. "He had men poison our water," the woman said, clutching a handkerchief. "Killed 50 head of cattle in one night, then offered to buy the land at a fraction of its worth. When my husband refused..." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. "Would you be willing to tell this to a judge?" I don't know. We have children now. If Dawson found out..." "He's going to keep doing this," Abigail said gently. "To other families, other children, unless someone stops him." By the time she returned to the ranch, she had 3 sworn statements and a promise from a federal marshal to investigate. She found Ethan standing watch on the porch, rifle across his knees. "Anything happen?" she asked. Climbing down from the wagon, Dawson's men rode by twice. Didn't stop. He pulled her close, breathing into her hair. "Missed you." "Missed you too." She leaned back to look at him. "But I brought something better than sweet words. I brought ammunition." That night, as they lay entwined in their bed, she told him everything she'd learned. With each revelation, she felt him tense, then relax as he realized they finally had weapons to fight back with. "You're remarkable," he said when she finished. "Have I mentioned that?" "Not in the last hour." He showed her how remarkable he thought she was. And for a while, they forgot about Dawson and drought and danger. But later, as Ethan slept, Abigail stared at the ceiling and planned. The battle had changed from one of intimidation to one of survival. Dawson had shown he was willing to kill to get what he wanted, but he'd underestimated them. He saw an aging rancher and a mail-order bride where he should have seen a family defending its home. Tomorrow, she'd send the statements to the federal marshal. Tomorrow, they'd start building their legal case. But tonight, she held her husband close and listened to Tommy's peaceful breathing from the next room, and knew that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The fire had been meant to break them. Instead, it had forged them into something harder, stronger. Dawson wanted a war. He'd get one. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when the riders came. 20 men, armed and moving with purpose. Dust rising behind them like a storm cloud. Ethan saw them first from the ridge where he'd been checking fence lines with Murphy. "Ride hard to the house," he told his foreman. "Tell Abby to get Tommy to the root cellar. Then ring the bell." The ranch bell, used for calling hands to meals, had taken on new meaning since the fire. 3 rings meant trouble. As Murphy galloped away, Ethan watched the riders fan out, cutting off escape routes. This was no intimidation visit. This was war. By the time he reached the house, his men were taking positions. Jake and 3 others behind the water trough, rifles ready. 2 more in the barn loft. Abigail stood on the porch, her Winchester steady in her hands. Tommy beside her with his own rifle. "I told you to get to the cellar," Ethan said as he dismounted. "And I told you I'm not Sarah." Her green eyes were hard as flint. "This is my home too." Dawson rode at the head of his men, but it was the stranger beside him that made Ethan's blood run cold. A hired gun from the look of him, black clothes, tied down holster, eyes like a rattlesnake. "Hurt." "McGraw," Dawson called, stopping just outside rifle range. "Last chance. Sign over the water rights and ride out. I'll even pay fair price for the land." "Not selling," Ethan called back. "Not to you, not ever." "Then you're a fool." Dawson nodded to the gunman. "Mister, Slate here has legal papers. Seems you've been rustling my cattle. McGraw, Sheriff Watson's on his way with a warrant." "That's a lie and you know it." "Prove it in court. Course. Trials take time. Shame if something happened while you were locked up." His eyes moved deliberately to Abigail and Tommy. The threat hung in the morning air like smoke. Ethan felt Abigail tense beside him, saw Tommy's young face harden with understanding. This was Dawson's final play false charges to separate them, then violence while he was helpless to prevent it. "You really want to do this?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying clearly, "In front of witnesses." Dawson laughed. "What witnesses, my men? They'll swear you drew first." That's when Abigail stepped forward, and Ethan saw Dawson's confidence waver. She held something in her hand, not a weapon, but papers. "These witnesses," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "Federal Marshal Thompson, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself." From the barn, the house, even from behind Dawson's own men, riders emerged. Federal badges glinted in the sun. Marshal Thompson, a grizzled veteran with eyes like winter, rode forward. Jeb Dawson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and murder in the case of Thomas Garrett. The marshal's voice was flat. Professional. You're manslate too, for the killing of Ben Hutchins up in Montana. We've been tracking him for months. The gunman's hand twitched toward his weapon, but froze as a dozen rifles swung his way. You set me up, Dawson snarled at Ethan. No, Abigail said calmly. You set yourself up. Every threat, every burned fence, every poisoned water hole, we documented it all. Mrs. Garrett was particularly helpful with dates and details. And this is my town, my territory. No, Marshal Thompson said. It's Wyoming territory, under federal law. And federal law doesn't take kindly to men who think they're above it. What happened next occurred with the speed of lightning. Slate, seeing his future in a noose, went for his gun. Ethan shoved Abigail aside as the shot rang out, feeling the bullet whisper past his ear. Then the morning exploded. Rifle fire erupted from both sides. Ethan dragged Abigail and Tommy behind the water trough as bullets chewed splinters from the porch. Jake and the ranch hands returned fire with deadly accuracy. The federal marshals moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding Dawson's confused men. Through the chaos, Ethan saw Slate drawing a bead on Tommy, who'd popped up to fire. Without thinking, Ethan stood, his rifle finding the gunman in its sights. They fired simultaneously. Slate's bullet caught Ethan high in the shoulder, spinning him around. But Ethan's shot was true. The gunman toppled from his saddle. His reign of terror ended in Wyoming dust. Ethan! Abigail's scream cut through the gunfire. She caught him as he fell, pressing her hand against the wound. Blood seeped between her fingers, hot and terrifying. Keep down, he gasped. But she was already tearing strips from her petticoat, packing the wound with steady hands. The battle, such as it was, ended quickly. Faced with federal badges and superior positioning, Dawson's hired men threw down their weapons. Dawson himself sat his horse in shock, watching his empire crumble. It's over, Dawson, Marshal Thompson said, taking the man's gun. You're going to hang, but not before you tell us about every ranch you've stolen, every man you've killed. As they led Dawson away, he looked back at Abigail with pure hatred. You did this. You turned him against me. No, she said, not looking up from tending Ethan's wound. You did this to yourself. You threatened our family. Did you really think we'd just roll over and die? Tommy appeared with medical supplies, his young face pale but determined. Together, they got Ethan into the house, onto the kitchen table where Abigail could work properly. Bullet's still in there, she said after examining the wound. Need to get it out. Doc's an hour away, Jake said. Can't wait that long. She looked at Ethan, her face set. I've done this before, in Baltimore, but it's going to hurt. Do it, he said through gritted teeth. Trust you. What followed was the longest hour of Abigail's life. With Tommy assisting and Jake holding Ethan down, she probed for the bullet, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Ethan bit down on a leather strap, sweat pouring off him, but he never cried out. Finally, her forceps found metal. The bullet came free with a wet sound, followed by a fresh flow of blood that she quickly staunched. Got it, she breathed, then set about cleaning and stitching the wound. By the time Doc Morrison arrived, the crisis had passed. He examined her work with professional approval. Couldn't have done better myself, he admitted. You've got healing hands, Mrs. McGraw. I've got a stubborn husband, she corrected. Too ornery to die on me. Ethan, pale but conscious, managed a weak smile. Not planning on it. Too much to live for. Marshal Thompson returned as evening fell. Dawson and his surviving men in custody. We've been building this case for months, he told them. Your documentation was the final piece we needed. Dawson's confessed to 3 murders and dozens of extortion schemes. He'll hang for sure. And our ranch, Abigail asked. Safe as houses. In fact, there might be a reward. Slate had bounties in 3 territories. After he left, they sat in the gathering darkness. Ethan propped in bed, Abigail beside him. Tommy curled in a chair. The danger that had shadowed them for months was gone, leaving behind a strange emptiness. We won, Tommy said wonderingly. We really won. We survived, Ethan corrected. Sometimes that's the same thing. Abigail took his good hand, careful of his bandages. Do you regret everything that's happened since I arrived? Only thing I regret is not sending for you sooner. He squeezed her fingers. You saved us. Abby, your planning, your courage. Without you, without me, you'd have found another way. You're the strongest man I know, Ethan McGraw, but I'm glad I was here to help. We all helped, Tommy said sleepily. That's what families do. And that, Abigail thought, was the truth of it. They'd started as strangers brought together by desperation and a newspaper ad. But under pressure, they'd forged themselves into something unbreakable. A family. That night, as Ethan slept fitfully beside her, Abigail kept watch. Through the window, she could see the stars, bright and countless. Somewhere out there, Dawson was in chains. His reign of terror ended. The ranch was safe. Tommy was safe. Her husband would heal. She thought of the woman she'd been just months ago, desperate, alone, selling herself to a stranger for the chance at a better life. That woman seemed like a stranger now. In her place sat Abigail McGraw, rancher's wife, crack shot, defender of her home. Thank you, she whispered to the stars, to God, to whatever force had brought her to this place. Ethan stirred, mumbling in his sleep. She soothed him with a gentle hand, and he settled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Healing, rebuilding, learning to live without the constant threat of danger. But they'd face them together. The morning brought unexpected visitors, Mrs. Cooper arrived with several church ladies, but their faces held respect now, not judgment. We've come to help, Martha Henderson said stiffly. What you did, defending your home, it was brave. It was necessary. Abigail replied, but she opened the door wider. Coffee's on. As the women bustled about, cooking and cleaning, Abigail marveled at the change. She'd won more than a physical battle. She'd won her place in this community. Ethan woke to the smell of fresh bread and the sound of women's voices. What's happening? The neighborhood's happened, Abigail said with a wry smile. Apparently, shooting outlaws earns you social acceptance. Who knew? He shifted, wincing. Help me up. Can't receive visitors flat on my back. You can and you will. She adjusted his pillows instead. Hero or not, you're staying in that bed until Doc says otherwise. Bossy woman. You're bossy woman, she corrected, kissing his forehead. Forever and always. Tommy appeared in the doorway, grinning. Federal Marshal left this for you. He handed over an envelope. Inside was a bank draft, the bounty for Slate, enough to rebuild the barn, restock their hay, and have plenty left over. We're rich, Tommy exclaimed. We were already rich, Ethan said, looking at his wife and son. This is just money. But Abigail was already planning new barn, better defenses, maybe even a school for the area children. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. What are you thinking? Ethan asked, recognizing her expression. I'm thinking about tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, she smiled. We've got a ranch to run, Mr. McGraw, cattle to raise, crops to plant, a son to finish educating. A son to adopt legal-like, Ethan added, making Tommy's eyes go wide. If he's willing? Yes, Tommy launched himself at the bed, stopping just short of Ethan's wounded shoulder. Yes, please. Can I call you Pa? I'd be honored. Watching them together. Abigail felt her heart swell. From mail-order bride to beloved wife. From stranger to defender. From childless to mother. The journey had been harrowing, but worth every moment. Outside, the ranch hands were already at work, repairing the damage from the morning's battle. Life went on, as it always did in the West. But inside this house, a family forged in fire and bound by love was writing its next chapter. Rich Cowboy found the family he missed, Ethan said softly, echoing his words from months ago. Chose her forever. And she chose him right back, Abigail replied. Forever and always. The sun climbed higher, blessing the Double M Ranch with golden light. Somewhere, Jeb Dawson awaited justice, but here, in this moment, there was only peace, love, and the promise of all the years to come. They'd won more than a battle. They'd won their future, and it was glorious. 6 months had passed since the battle with Dawson, and the Double M Ranch showed the changes like a woman wearing new Sunday clothes. The barn stood tall and proud, built stronger than before, painted red as blood against the Wyoming sky. Fences ran straight and true, the water ran clear in Miller's Creek, and the cattle had grown fat on good grass. But the biggest changes weren't in the buildings or the land. They were in the family that called this place home. Abigail stood at the kitchen window, watching Ethan and Tommy work with a young colt in the corral. Her husband moved carefully still, his shoulder stiff from the old wound, but his laughter carried across the yard as Tommy tried to stay mounted on the spirited animal. You're daydreaming again, Maria said, smiling as she kneaded bread dough. The Mexican woman came daily now, not just for cooking but for companionship. In the months since Dawson's defeat, Abigail had built a network of friendships among the ranch wives. Just thinking how different it all is, Abigail admitted. When I stepped off that stage, I never imagined that you'd fall in love with the man who bought you. That I'd find a home, Abigail corrected, though she smiled. The love was unexpected. Through the window, she saw riders approaching. Her hand didn't go to the rifle anymore. Those days were past. Instead, she recognized Jake returning from town with the mail and supplies. Letter for you, Mrs. McGraw, Jake said, handing over an envelope with Eastern writing. From Baltimore. Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Letters from her old life were rare, each one a reminder of how far she'd traveled. This one was from Margaret, her only real friend from the factory days. As she read, her expression shifted from pleasure to concern. Margaret was in trouble. The factory had closed, leaving dozens of women without work. She had a child now, no husband, nowhere to turn. Bad news, Ethan asked, entering with Tommy. They were both dusty and grinning, the morning's work sitting well on them. Abigail handed him the letter. As he read, she watched his face, loving how his brow furrowed in concentration, how he absently ruffled Tommy's hair as the boy leaned against him. Invite her, he said simply. What? Your friend. Invite her here. We've got room. And Lord knows we could use more help with the garden expansion you're planning. Ethan McGraw, are you starting a home for wayward women? I'm starting a community, he corrected, pulling her close with his good arm. Way I see it, this land's too big for just us. Been thinking about that school you mentioned. Maybe some smaller homesteads for married hands who want to settle. Tommy piped up. And maybe more kids for me to play with, being the only young one gets lonely sometimes. Abigail looked between her two men, heart full. You've been planning this. Been discussing it, Ethan admitted. Jake's sweet on the widow Harrison in town. Murphy's been writing to his sister about coming west. Seems like the Double M could be more than just a ranch. That evening, as she wrote to Margaret, Abigail reflected on the circular nature of life. She'd answered an advertisement for a new beginning, and now she was offering the same chance to another desperate woman. The next weeks brought a flurry of activity. The old foreman's cabin was cleaned and expanded. Plans were drawn for a schoolhouse near the main road. And one bright Tuesday, Margaret Stevens arrived with her daughter Lucy, both thin and travel-worn, but with hope brightening their eyes. "This is really your home," Margaret whispered, taking in the sprawling ranch. "All of it." "Our home," Abigail corrected. "And yours now, if you want it." The integration wasn't without challenges. Margaret was skittish around the men, Lucy shy and clingy, but Tommy, with the wisdom of a child who'd known hardship, took the little girl under his wing. Within days, they were inseparable, Tommy teaching her to ride and showing her his favorite hiding spots. "You're building something special here." Mrs. Cooper observed during one of her visits. She'd become a regular fixture, bringing news from town and taking back Abigail's extra preserves and pies for the church bazaars. "We're building a life," Abigail replied, "the one we all deserve." Summer brought more changes. Jake did indeed marry the widow Harrison, bringing her and her twin boys to the ranch. Murphy's sister arrived with her husband, a blacksmith whose skills proved invaluable. The schoolhouse went up with the whole community helping, and they hired a teacher from Denver, Miss Catherine Powell, young and idealistic and completely unfazed by frontier life. The first day of school saw 8 children seated at desks. Tommy proud as punch to be the eldest and most advanced student. Abigail stood with the other mothers, watching their children begin their education, and felt tears prick her eyes. "You did this," Ethan said quietly beside her. "Your dream made real." "Our dream," she corrected. "None of this happens without you saying yes." That night, they walked up to the cemetery hill together, a ritual they'd established monthly. The wooden crosses had been replaced with proper headstones, and wildflowers grew around them. Ethan laid his hand on Sarah's stone, then Billy's. "I kept my promise," he said softly. "Built something lasting, found love again. Hope you're at peace with that." Abigail stayed quiet, letting him have his moment with the past. She'd learned that loving Ethan meant accepting all of him, including the ghosts he carried. When he turned to her, she saw peace in his eyes that hadn't been there when she first arrived. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For being strong enough to love a broken man. For seeing what we could build together. For choosing us." "I'll always choose us," she promised. Fall arrived with a celebration. The official adoption papers for Tommy were signed, making him legally Thomas Ethan McGraw. The boy stood tall as Judge Patterson made it official, then dissolved into tears of joy in his parents' arms. "My son," Ethan said, voice rough with emotion. "My boy." The party that followed filled the ranch with laughter and music. Jake played fiddle while Murphy called dances. Children ran between the adults' legs, and tables groaned under the weight of shared food. Martha Henderson, now one of Abigail's staunchest supporters, organized the women with military efficiency. "To think I once disapproved," Martha confided as they watched the dancing. "You've brought more life to this valley than we've seen in years." As winter approached, Abigail noticed changes in herself, a tiredness that wasn't quite normal, a sensitivity to certain smells. When Doc Morrison confirmed her suspicions, she sat in stunned silence for a full minute. "A baby," she finally whispered. "Due in spring. I'd say, congratulations, Mrs. McGraw." She found Ethan in the barn, checking on the horses before the coming storm. He looked up as she entered, immediately alert to her mood. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She took his hands, placed them on her still flat belly. "Everything's actually quite right." The understanding dawned slowly, transforming his face. "A baby, we're having a baby." "We are." He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around before remembering to be gentle. His whoop of joy brought Jake and Tommy running. "We're having a baby," Ethan announced to the world. Tommy's face went through several expressions before settling on joy. "A little brother or sister, really?" "Really," Abigail confirmed, pulling him into their embrace. You're going to be the best big brother." That night, as snow began to fall, they sat before the fire planning. Names were debated, rooms discussed, dreams shared. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with possibility. "I've been thinking about our story," Abigail said, secure in Ethan's arms. "How unlikely it all was. A desperate woman, a lonely man, a boy who needed a home. We could have passed each other by so easily." "But we didn't," Ethan pointed out. "Maybe it wasn't chance. Maybe it was meant to be." "A rancher bought a bride," she said, echoing his old words. "Rich Cowboy found the family he missed. Chose her forever," he finished. "And I'd choose you again, every day for the rest of my life." The snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. In the barn, horses dozed. In the bunkhouse, hands played cards and told stories. In the other cabins, families settled in for the night, children tucked safe in their beds. And in the main house, a mail-order bride who'd become so much more sat with her husband and son, planning for a baby who would be born into a community built on love, trust, and the courage to reach for happiness despite the odds. The Double M Ranch had become more than a cattle operation. It had become a beacon of hope in the Wyoming Territory. Proof that families could be made, not just born, that love could grow from the most practical beginnings, that sometimes the greatest adventures began with a simple advertisement in a newspaper. As the evening deepened, Tommy read aloud from his studies, his voice growing confident with practice. Margaret and Lucy joined them. Adding to the family circle, Jake and his new family stopped by with news of cattle prices. The teacher, Miss Powell, brought lessons for Tommy to work on. This was what home looked like, not just walls and a roof, but people who chose each other, who built something together, who faced whatever came with united strength. "You know what I think," Abigail said as they prepared for bed. The house finally quiet. "I think we should put up that sign you mentioned once." "What sign?" "Home of Ethan, Abby, and Tommy McGraw, where no one is left alone, though we'll need to add to it soon." Ethan smiled, pulling her close. "We'll need a bigger sign. We'll need a bigger everything," she laughed. "But that's tomorrow's challenge. And tomorrow's joy," he added. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the snow sparkling like diamonds. Tommy was first up, as always, eager to check on the animals. Margaret had breakfast started before Abigail could protest. Lucy helped set the table with careful concentration. This was their life now, rich beyond money, full beyond measure. A rancher who'd bought a bride had discovered love. A desperate woman had found her strength. An orphaned boy had gained a family. And from those unlikely beginnings, a whole community had grown. The wooden sign went up a week later, carved by Murphy's talented hands. But everyone who visited knew the real message wasn't in the words, but in the warmth of the welcome. The laughter from the schoolhouse, the sight of children playing safely while their parents built dreams from Wyoming soil. Home of the McGraw family, where love grows wild and free. And in the spring, when Abigail's daughter was born with her father's storm cloud eyes and her mother's determined chin, the circle of love grew wider still. Little Sarah McGraw, named for the past but born into a future bright with promise, was welcomed by a dozen families who'd found their way to the Double M. A rancher bought a bride, but in the end, they'd purchased so much more. A future, a family, a forever that neither had dared dream when that first letter crossed the miles between them. And that, as all good stories should, was just the beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts about Ethan and Abigail's journey. If you enjoyed this tale from the Wild West, please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and don't forget to hit the hype button to help more people discover these stories of love and courage in the American frontier. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to share more stories with you. Until next time, partners.